Good morning, I'm Joan Conrow and welcome to Alliance for Science Live. Our topic today is agroecology. It's one that has long intrigued me, in part because I've heard it bandied about a lot, but I've never been clear on exactly what it is. The Alliance for Science doesn't have a policy on agroecology. Our position is that farmers should have access to tools and information about all the agricultural systems so they can make the choices that best meet the unique conditions of their farm. I've learned there is no one-size-fits-all approach in agriculture. So to help us better understand agroecology, I organized this panel for a discussion. I had confirmed 2 scientists who specialize in agroecology, but unfortunately they withdrew from the panel earlier this week. It's always my hope that everyone, and especially scientists, can sit down and discuss ways to address the pressing issues of our time, 2 of which are feeding billions of people without bringing more wildland into production, while protecting Earth's greatly imperiled biodiversity, responding to the uncertainties of climate change, and substantially reducing agriculture's carbon footprint. It's a big puzzle, which underscores once again the need for a wide range of approaches and combinations of approaches to solve it. So I'm pleased we have 3 well-informed guests today who can help us understand agroecology, its obstacles and opportunities, and its potential place in the global agricultural landscape. Dr. Pam Ronald is a professor in the Genome Center and the Department of Plant Pathology, as well as the founding director of the Institute for Food and Agricultural Literacy at the University of California, Davis. She's also on the Alliance for Science Advisory Board. Welcome, Pam.
Hello.
Nassib Mugwanya is an agricultural communications specialist from Uganda, who is currently a PhD candidate at North Carolina State University. He's a 2015 Global Leadership Fellow at the Alliance for Science and a former fellow at the Breakthrough Institute. Welcome, Nassib.
Thank you. Hello.
And we have Dr. Frédéric Baudron. He's a senior scientist and a systems agronomist at CIMMYT, based in Zimbabwe. Welcome, Fred.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
So, Fred, we'll start with you because I know you've done some recent research in agroecology. Can you tell us, is there a scientific definition for the term, and how would you define it? What does it mean to you?
Yes, so of course we all know that agroecology has 2 different meanings, a science definition, agroecology as a science and agroecology as a movement. I'm a researcher, so I will mainly be talking about agroecology as a science. So to me, I think in my work, I define agroecology in its broadest sense. I mean, this definition that has been around for almost a century. So really, this is like the application of ecology in agriculture. And that's really the way I would say I practice agroecology in my research. What does that mean concretely? It means like manipulating biodiversity in agroecosystem to maximize ecosystem services for the benefit of farmers. But of course, there's now a broader definition by FAO. In particular, FAO has now defined agroecology with 10 components. Some components would like match, I would say, agroecology as a science, and some perhaps more agroecology as a movement. So diversity, synergies, efficiency, resilience, recycling, I would say those are probably the basis of agroecology as a science. And then I added 5 other components that are more probably related to agroecology as a movement: co-creation and sharing of knowledge, human and social values, culture and food traditions, responsible governance, and circular and solidarity economy. So I would say my own approach is probably a very neutral one to agroecology as a science, but of course we know there's this definition of agroecology more as a movement. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's good to know what is the science definition and what is the ideology definition, because they can be different. Nassib, let's go to you, and what are your thoughts? How do you define agroecology?
Thanks, John. The very first time I heard the term agroecology, my layman's interpretation was obvious. My background is agriculture science and my major is agriculture extension. So it struck me like a hybrid of agriculture and ecology. And to me already that wasn't so hard to process as a scientist by training, until when there was a sort of conversation that seems to suggest like there's other definitions of agroecology. So that's when I gained a deeper and more open-minded interest in learning more about agroecology. And it struck me that there's the science, practice, and movement version. And I sided mostly with the science version because that's my background. And to me, it's the application of ecological principles to agriculture systems and practices. And when I looked at the movement and practice version of agroecology, they seem to only expand the core version by adding other aspects of the food system like social, political, and cultural aspects. And that's where I realized that it's a very complex term and it can mean different things to different people depending on who you speak with.
Okay. Pam, let's go to you. How do you define agroecology? And then also too, since all three of you are science-based, how do you bring together some sort of synthesis between something that has a scientific component and an ideological component? I mean, how do you sort of merge those two elements? Pam?
Well, I appreciate Fred and Nassib's definitions. It's very helpful. I've always thought about agroecology as simply the application of ecology to agriculture, and it's something I've been very interested in. I think, of course, overall, the important challenges are to enhance sustainable agriculture, to think about how we can reduce harmful inputs, how we can enhance food security for farmers and support the rural livelihoods, and foster soil fertility. So there's a lot of aspects of agriculture, sustainable agriculture, that are very important. And I think agroecology has an important role because one of the aspects of agroecology is to study the interaction of species in an agricultural biosystem. So that includes pests and predators of those pests, thinking about ways to manage the cropping system in terms of genetic diversity, and to think about alternative approaches to some of the insecticides that can be quite toxic to farmers and their families. And so I've been very interested in this term and interested in some of the things that I've seen coming out of the science. And I'm a geneticist, so I obviously recognize there's many aspects of farming that are important for a healthy ecosystem, a healthy farming ecosystem. But as a geneticist, I think more about how can we develop seeds that are genetically improved that will contribute to these broader goals of agroecology.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, when you're a scientist and you're working on a research project, but then there are also social and ideological aspects involved. How do scientists address some of these systems of agriculture that have an ideological component? I don't know which of you would like to go first on that one.
I mean, maybe I can just say that I don't think farmers think about it that way. Most farmers that I have met are very concerned with the challenge of growing crops, and every specific ecosystem is going to be different for that farmer's challenge. So farmers are really very, very busy, and they often don't have time to get involved in ideological debates. So I'm not sure that question maybe is relevant to what farmers are doing every day, whether you're a subsistence farmer in Bangladesh or India, or whether you're an organic farmer in California. Farmers are very, very focused on trying to enhance the sustainability and productivity of their systems. But I'd be really interested to hear what Fred and Nassib have to say.
Oh yeah, going off what you just said, Pam, I've spent I started my career as an agriculture extension worker in Uganda, and this has been like about 10 years now. And I agree with you that farmers in their different contexts will always approach their farming in terms of practical solutions, what works for them, given a particular problem they are facing. A farmer who is having a pest problem would always think of what's the best way I can deal with this pest. And me as an agriculture extension worker, my role is to help farmers navigate the different options that can help them make informed decisions on what sort of solution to adopt or not. And so going back to John's question, when it comes to research and combining all these sorts of ideologies, to me, as someone who has worked with scientists, I can tell you that no scientist out there I know in Uganda works on a problem that doesn't take care of the social aspects of the environment they're working in. And so the very first time I heard agroecology as a movement and seemingly trying to be sort of like opposed to newer advances in technology or agricultural innovations, it gave me a hard time to reconcile that. I was honestly not seeing how, newer advances in science in terms of technologies cannot fit within the agroecological thinking about food systems. So, and I think this is where we have to have a conversation and sort of go past ideologies and sort of see the contextual realities of what farmers are facing today and what sort of options do we have on the table and how can we harness holistic approaches like agroecology, not to exclude some solutions, but rather embrace whatever farmers can adopt on their farms.
Fred?
Yeah, I think I agree with both what Pam and Nassib said. I mean, farmers have, don't normally put in boxes practices in terms of what is agroecology, what would be like conventional farming, etc. I think farming is all about pragmatism, flexibility, and really trying to make it work. And I think, like, especially in the global south, yes, farmers have a very hard life farming, and not too much time actually to worry about such ideological debate. Having said that, I think in terms of the research we are doing, we are trying to bring the best evidence we can, really try to also be very explicit about trade-offs. I think every innovation, I mean, if you tweak a system, there will be always losers and winners. I mean, if you tweak, there will be trade-offs are everywhere. So if you start like modifying a system, there will be trade-offs. So I think we need to be very explicit about the trade-offs. What are the benefits? What are the costs? What are the potential risks? But of course, this is also muddled into ideology. We know very well that some funders, for instance, would not accept certain practices compared to some other funders. Some funders actually don't want to see herbicides in the project that they fund. In some of my portfolio, some donors are much more open in terms of what technology can go in, what they are funding or not. So I think the ideology is much more at the level of probably donors and society than farmers themselves, which, one more time, are all about flexibility and pragmatism.
The question of funding is an interesting one, and I do want to get into that a little bit later, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what does the science tell us about agroecology? Does it work? What are its promises and pitfalls? So maybe Fred, you could start with that one and just tell us a little bit about what do you think the science has really been able to tell us?
Well, I will talk about my own research, perhaps.
Yeah, please.
And published work that actually people can find. Most of it is open access. I think like there's probably three big areas where I see like agroecology as having potential and demonstrated potential. First of all, we've done quite a bit of work in Ethiopia on controlling stem borer. Quite a bit of work now in Zimbabwe on controlling Spodoptera frugiperda, so the fall armyworm, which invaded the continent a few years ago. And I think like diversification, whether at farm, at plot, farm, landscape level, I mean, we have proven evidence that actually it can help, it can play. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but I think like really diversification for pest suppression, for biocontrol really has a role to play. And I think it's a big potential for agroecology, pest control. And we have a lot, you know, of new pests and diseases coming actually, not only COVID for people, but also zoonosis and even for crops. So I think this is quite important. I think crop livestock integration is probably another one, and I've worked quite a bit on that. So, I mean, as a way to minimize the negative impact of livestock on the environment, but also to cycle nutrients and to maintain soil fertility. So I think there is a lot of potential, not only in the agriculture in the South, actually, I think also in the North. See a lot of farms, whether in North America or in Europe, like reintegrating now livestock and crop. And I think there's a lot of potential for synergies and recycling. And perhaps the last one on which I've worked also a little bit is the inclusion of trees on farm and in landscape. So call it agroforestry, if you will. But I think for soil fertility maintenance, one more time, but also for climate adaptation, especially like some of the work we've done in the Rift Valley of Ethiopia, maintaining trees really can play a role to actually mitigate against changing climate. So I would say I've personally witnessed and collected evidence that for, I think, pest regulation, for crop livestock integration, and for agroforestry or, you know, maintaining trees on farm, if you may consider those as you know, agroecological component, I think those can have a lot of potential for farming.
Well, it's great to hear about the pest control, because I think everyone shares, or pretty much everyone shares, the goal of trying to reduce pesticide use. And with climate change, the indications are all that the pest pressure will just increase, particularly in Africa and other tropical areas. So that's an important one. You know, what about you, Nassib, in your review of the literature and your studies? What have you found that the science has told you about agroecology?
Well, I would say there's almost mainstream scientific consensus regarding how, like, if you optimize the different components within a biological system and did it so well, you will definitely get some yields or outputs from that. And that is basically reliant like on the thinking that, you know, nature, if well handled, will give you the best. And I agree with that notion. But we all know, or for those who may not know, that sometimes nature is not inherently perfect to give us the best that we want amid its certain farming conditions. And that's where like other technologies come in to sort of help nature with its sort of inherent limitations. And I would say, to me, the science is very clear that technology, if judiciously applied, can fit within the agroecological systems thinking.
And what about you, Pam? If you could weigh in. I noticed you're muted, so remember to unmute yourself before you respond, please. Okay, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoy hearing these broader perspectives about agroecology, and of course, it can be very large, talking about livestock integration and agroforestry, very, very important. I, of course, am a geneticist, so I'm not working at that community level, but I've been very interested in, you know, my interpretation of agroecology to see how scientists have used bacterial, natural occurring bacterial pesticides to reduce reliance on chemical insecticides. And it's really a fantastic story, and maybe just briefly touch on the BT story. So it's a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, produces a toxin that is targeted to insect pests that are harmful to many different types of crops. And it's been really fantastic to watch. So maybe about 50 years ago, scientists began to understand the components of the bacteria that could target these insect pests, and organic farmers have been using BT to spray on crops for many, many years, and it's been a really successful approach in the sense that it's not harmful to humans and other wildlife, and has been a really important part of the organic farming system. And as we've advanced in our knowledge of plant microbe interactions and genetic improvement, scientists were able to isolate that particular gene from the bacteria and introduce it into the plant. And so it's been really important for many crops, including eggplant in Bangladesh, cotton in India, corn in the United States. Really many crops around the world have been engineered to produce this bacterial protein and have massively reduced chemical insecticide sprays. And it's very useful because when you spray it on the crop, sometimes it doesn't actually get into the tissue that will protect the crop from the insect. And if scientists are able to express it in that tissue, it's much more effective. And in many places in the world, such as Bangladesh, it's very costly and difficult to find the spray. So there's a lot of reasons that farmers have embraced these BT crops. And it didn't end there, because Fred Gould, who is one of Nassib's mentors at NC State, and his colleagues, Bruce Tabashnik, they've done many years of studies looking at the ecosystems on the BT crop farms. And it's really very fascinating. In China, there's been many studies that have shown there's an enhanced insect biodiversity, farmers using BT crops, because there's no longer spraying insecticides that kill all the insects in the field. BT is very targeted. And it's also been really very important, the research that entomologists and ecologists have done to show that you really need to have a mixed cropping system, in the sense that you don't want to plant a monoculture of the BT crops. And scientists have looked at that selection pressure and the type of balance that you need to assure that this BT approach will be sustainable. So it's really gone from 50 years of research to, I think, a very advanced agroecology studies that have been carried out by Fred Gould, Bruce Tabashnik, and others. And so that's sort of a geneticist view of how seed can contribute to an agroecological system and reduce insecticide use.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about where are some good places for agroecology to be implemented. And I lived in Hawaii for many, many years, and I know that even though you can grow a lot of things in the tropics, you also have a lot of pest pressure, disease pressure, and other things. So there is this trend now to try to increase adoption of agroecology in Africa, which has a lot of growing pressures. So let's talk a little bit about, what are some of the opportunities and constraints in its adoption, particularly in Africa. So maybe let's move over to Nassib and Fred, since you both worked in that regard. Fred, would you like to start?
Yes, constraints in Africa. I think like one of the main one I see would be like the labor constraint. I think a lot of those approaches based on agroecology, means like, moving biomass around, etc. So it has a lot of implication for labor. And that's why over the last 7-8 years, I worked a lot actually on appropriate scale mechanization, exactly for that. I think labor is not plentiful in African farming systems. That's often, I think, a misconception. So I think labor is one. The second one, of course, we're talking of a system which is rather knowledge intensive and not input intensive, obviously. And not all farmers are ready to go through the ups and downs of, adaptive learning and failures sometimes, etc. So I think this is a system which is geared towards like really farmers that are quite passionate about farming, and not all farmers are actually are there out of choice. Some of those are farming because there's no other opportunities. So perhaps the knowledge intensity is another one. Another one I'd like to mention is perhaps the site specificity. And of course, this is one of the principles of agroecology. I would think of one landscape that we have published extensively about in South Ethiopia. I think it could be seen as really one model of an agroecological landscape. So for pest regulation, fertility, etc. So really a good example of synergies between biodiversity and farming. But it's very hard to see how you can take actually the learnings from this particular landscape to another landscape. So the scalability actually of agroecology is also a bit of an issue. So I think that's the limitation. Perhaps I will mention, jumping on what Nassib mentioned earlier, like the need for complementary practices also. I would say, for example, recycling is one major component of agroecology, recycling nutrients. In a lot of systems where I work or have been working, I mean, I can think of those granitic sandy soils in Zimbabwe, just nearby. There's very little nutrients to recycle. So actually, I mean, recycling nutrients won't lead to improved productivity. I mean, you will need some input. You will need some nutrients in those systems in order to have anything at all to recycle. Actually, so I think like in a lot of places, actually, like those principles would need also perhaps some input to complement. I think in terms of pest management as well, I mentioned some of the work we do on fall armyworm. I mean, what really we are promoting as CIMMYT is an integrated approach to that. So also using like improved seeds, using also like a proper control of pesticide as well as agroecological principles. That tends to be more effective than just using like some of those agroecological principles alone. So I would say perhaps another of the limitation I see.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. I think there's a big misperception everywhere that labor is a problem in farming everywhere around the world that I've encountered. I mean, just people don't really want to work on the farm so much, and it's a tough job. And I think all over the world we're finding that problem of bringing new farmers into agriculture, so that and the whole issue of day labor is a big problem too. So Nassib, what are your thoughts about, what are some of the opportunities and constraints on agroecology in Africa? You've worked with farmers closely in Uganda. So what are your thoughts here? And unmute yourself, please.
Well, I would say that already what is predominantly being done by smallholder farmers in Africa is not radically different from the principles agroecology seeks to advance. Farmers are largely reliant on Mother Nature for their farming needs. They use less inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, and I would say this is just common sense that most farmers are really like not that rich to afford buying some of these modern inputs. And sometimes where nature can sufficiently provide for their farming needs, there's no good reason for them to use external inputs or modern technologies. So I see already actually that agroecology, much as farmers in Africa have not called it so, has already been happening. And so this is where actually sometimes I get to wrestle with the thought of like, where's the novelty in terms of what the movement is trying to promote? All I see is something already that has been done for centuries by farmers, relying mostly on intercropping systems, mulching, saving seeds. And we've seen how far they can go with that kind of farming system. And I'm not dismissive of the merits of traditional farming practices, but I also know for the time I've lived with farmers that there are limitations to how much some of these traditional technologies can help. For example, right now, any farmer growing cassava, which is a food security crop eaten by more than 13 million Ugandans, is facing the viral problem of cassava virus disease and mosaic. And all the natural ways of dealing with that, all the traditional ways of thinking about addressing cassava mosaic and brown streak disease for the last 20 plus years have not yielded much benefits. And we see newer advances in science like genetic engineering giving promising headways in terms of addressing problems like brown streak disease. And so may I see an opportunity there where agroecology can sort of blend with newer advances in science, and the conversation we should have is how this can happen and how best to do it in a way that still doesn't ruin the agroecological values or norms.
Good points. So I want to let our audience know that we will be taking questions from the audience, so you can put them in the Q&A section of Zoom, and also in the comment section on Facebook, and we'll pull them from there. But, you know, Pam, I'd like you to weigh in a little bit on, you know, principles of agroecology in places in the West, you know, in the US, which are already highly mechanized and things like that. Where do you see agroecology fitting in, and in the West, and what are some of the opportunities and constraints in its adoption here?
Farmers, one sort of basic aspect of agroecology, I would think, would be crop rotation, and this concept that if you build up over time the same crop, the same cropping system, and do the same thing every year, it increases the vulnerability of that crop to pest and disease. So I think it is very important to have different types of crop rotation, both in terms of different species that are cropping, and then biodiversity, genetic diversity within the crop. And that, I would say, it's been really important to organic agriculture, and it's also increasingly important to other types of agriculture that we see in the West. And so I think when you're talking about sort of commercial agriculture, so, you know, subsistence systems are really very different than commercial systems in the West, in the United States. So, for example, organic farmers and other farmers are buying their seed, they're buying their inputs, and then they're selling their crop at a profit. So it's a really different type of environment, not just producing food for their families, but to feed hundreds of other people, sometimes thousands of other people. So different pressures in those systems. And the very large farms are highly mechanized, whether they're organic farms or other types of farms. And so in those instances, it's becoming very important to have really precise types of applications to reduce the amount of external inputs, to consider modern approaches in terms of whether you're going to put pheromones in your field to try to attract or repel pests, to whether you're trying to use a BT crop, for example, to reduce insecticides, or have some kind of targeted fertilizers. And then, of course, an important part of agroecology is nitrogen fixation. So a lot of crops, legumes, can fix their own nitrogen. And so that's an important part of a rotation system.
That's a good segue into my next question, which is, you know, what does agroecology have in common with some of these other systems of agriculture, like conservation agriculture, conventional agriculture, sustainable intensification, regeneration? I mean, there are many different styles of agriculture. So where do some of these systems overlap and diverge? Who'd like to go first?
Maybe I'll just quickly say that we've gotten so deep into these terms. It's really complicated to name agriculture in that way. So conventional agriculture has become popular to use that term, but it's really confusing, right? What is conventional agriculture? And it really, I think, is defined just that it's not organic agriculture. And so that means that, well, in the United States, organic agriculture is maybe 1% to 2% agriculture, and so that's 98% lumped into conventional agriculture. But then you have a huge spectrum of, you know, large farms, small farms, and conventional agriculture can use some use genetically engineered crops, some maybe don't use external inputs, and so I think it's just a really confusing term, and maybe we need to get away from these terms and just think a little bit more about enhancing sustainable agriculture in all systems. And the only, I'd say that organic agriculture is well defined because there's a certification system, both in the United States and in Europe and other countries, which limits the types of seeds that can be used and the types of inputs that can be used. And organic agriculture has really advanced, I think, our thinking on agroecology, but it's not defined as a sustainable agricultural system because organic agriculture also has many, many challenges. So I think if we can get away from these terms, and I'm sorry I don't have another term to substitute for, but I think it's nice if we can just think of global agriculture and trying to enhance the sustainability and agroecological practices of a farmer on a particular farm. And sometimes I think it's difficult conversation because many consumers have probably not visited a commercial farm or subsistence farm. And so the language becomes so removed from what farmers are actually doing. And I'd love to hear what Fred and Nassib have to say. If there's another term we can use for conventional agriculture, which I think is not, the way it's used now is not really meaningful or representative of the diverse kinds of farms that are out there in the world.
I agree with you, Pam. And going off what you just said, the terms conventional, for the time I've lived here in America, mean like, you know, all things related to industrial farming practices, you know, modern inputs and stuff like that. And to me, when I see the movement version of agroecology with its dissatisfaction with the models of farming here and sort of going with the same sort of advocacy in places like Africa to say, we are sick of conventional farming practices, it gets me to think that actually conventional in Africa is different from conventional in America or Europe. And so if you run from America or Europe and you be like going to Africa to preach about, oh, we should get rid of conventional ag practices, they're not good for the environment, I'm like, I'm afraid you may actually be fighting what you're trying to promote, because what is widespread or conventional in Africa is small scale, farmers relying on nature, them being like intercropped, mulching. And so we need to have that sort of nuance when it comes to what are we calling conventional here? And is conventional the same everywhere? But to answer your question, John, for me, what I see in terms of convergence is that all these models seek to transform. They have that good intention that they want the best of what we do in terms of farming with minimal impacts on the environment. And so if we get rid of the ideologies we subscribe to and sort of see the contextual realities of where we want agroecology to be applied, we should be cognizant of what has worked in this context and how much can we achieve in terms of moving from where we are now to the next level. And so to me, I think the convergence is around, they all seek to have the same environmental outcomes, minimum damage on the environment, but the disagreement is in terms of how to achieve that. And I shouldn't see why we are even disagreeing if we listen to each other and realize that we all seek to have farmers who are food secure, more nutritious food, and we should just get on the table and see whatever options are there and how they can fit in a model that is very sustainable for humans and the environment.
You know, Fred, you mentioned that farmers are very pragmatic and they're not really sort of looking at or labeling these systems when they're doing things in their fields. I mean, are we getting a little too hung up on the labels around these agricultural systems? And what are your thoughts on how we can address that issue?
Yeah, I think I agree with Pam and Nassib. I think this is largely also a semantic debate, all these definitions, and it's probably confusing consumers and confusing farmers and even researchers. My own program is called Sustainable Intensification Program within CIMMYT, and sometimes it's very hard also for even people who belong to this program to understand what this means. And I think perhaps that's also what Nassib mentioned. It's more about a trajectory than defining like particular systems. I think we want a form of intensification that minimize, you know, possible environmental negative effect and possible social negative effect as well. And I think that's a very broad definition of sustainable intensification. I think this is perhaps broader than what agroecology would mean. I think for most of this sustainable intensification system, biodiversity is probably an output. It's about like minimizing impact on biodiversity, but I think like agroecology recognizes really biodiversity as specifically as an input from those ecosystem services. But altogether, I think we all, yeah, as Nassib mentioned, we all want the same thing. This is a trajectory. We want to minimize social and environmental negative consequences of, you know, some of those models of intensification. We don't want to repeat some of those models that perhaps had too many negative consequences. And yes, perhaps it would be good to move away from these labels. Yeah, how to do that, I don't know. A lot of those are also very savvy about these labels. So this is a complex problem to move away from it.
Yeah, we do seem as humans to want to label and categorize, and then we can all sort of decide where to belong. But it does seem like, especially in agriculture, and when you get right down to the farm level, there's a lot of overlap with farmers just trying to pull whatever they can to get a crop off. Which leads me to, you know, there has been this recent, you know, a lot of talk about agroecology. It's gotten a place now in FAO. So what do each of you think is driving the agroecology movement now? Nassib, you go first.
Money. Well, that's a joke, but I would say, you know, all movements stand for causes. And oftentimes causes start with good intentions. And I would say when you look at the agroecological movement, at its core, it's to promote more friendlier ways of doing agriculture in a way that doesn't harm the environment. And also taking care of other aspects of the food system, like, you know, social justice. To me, I wouldn't fight such a cause. Who would want to fight social justice? Who would want to fight a fairer food system? But I think the problem comes in when movements get so radical in terms of their ideology and sort of making it seem like this is the way to go. And what I've seen in terms of the agroecology movement in places like Africa, the dominant version of agroecology seems to me as an ideological extension of the welfare and privileged folks in the West that sort of run to places like Africa and sort of use all these narratives of like, we don't want Africa to go through the same problems like the West or Europe or America, forgetting that the contextual realities of Africa and Europe are totally different. I've seen the problems here people have, and food is none of those problems. Where I come from, I can tell you, and as part of someone who grew up in Uganda, I know what it means to go without a meal a day. Now, you realize that some of the folks in these movements have these ideal notions of this is the better way the food system should look like, but those ideal notions are informed by their Western dissatisfaction with whatever has gone wrong with the systems here. and they run to places like Africa to start to preach, forgetting that we are totally different contexts. And that's where we need to have a very honest and nuanced conversation on what mode of agroecology are you trying to promote? And are you really caring about the needs of the farmers, getting them out of poverty, helping them have more food, or you're caring for the needs of your ideologies of, purist, thinkings around food and, the environment?
So I'll kind of segue from that, Nassib, into an issue or question that is a little bit related to one that was in the Q&A section, and that is, a lot of what we focus on when we're looking at the value of an agricultural system is yield. So how do we really bring in some of these other concepts like social justice, environmental sustainability, farmers' livelihoods, protecting indigenous crops? How do we bring those things in while also paying attention to what farmers and everyone is thinking about too, which is yield, because, they're producing a crop for a particular reason, which is to feed themselves and or make some additional income. So, Pam and Fred, what are your thoughts on how we can bring some of those concepts into our discussions and practices of agriculture without becoming too ideological on just, without being entirely ideologically based?
I think one of the 10 components from the FAO definition of agroecology, if I want to go back to this one, is like really this co-construction. And I think it's also important to have systems that are adaptive to local circumstances. And I think that can be a way to make sure actually that what we are promoting as researchers and developers, and to maybe echo what Nassib was saying, is adapted to the context, not something that is parachuted from a really another context and is not fitting properly. I think I agree with Nassib on the fact that, I've spent 19 years working with and for smallholders in Eastern and Southern Africa. And this is not a romantic life for many of them. And this is really a system which is in need of transformation. And this is not, real transformation needs more than just tweaking the system. That's for sure. But my interpretation of agroecology, in the work I'm doing, and I think it's in my own views, really ticking the box of agroecology in many ways. But we use improved seeds. We can't just use local seeds with very little, very poor yield potential. We use fertilizer when it be, etc. So I think one more time, a pragmatic approach, but I still believe that what I'm doing, a lot of what I'm doing actually meets the criteria, at least of my own definition of agroecology. But indeed, there's need for transformation, but there's need also for really local adaptation of the system that are promoted. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Pam, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I really appreciate what Nassib and Fred are saying, and I think that we're not going to have a transformation unless we have both compassion and scientific evidence. And so the work that Fred and his colleagues are doing, for example, is really very important because they're getting data and experimentation to figure out what types of systems are going to work in a particular environment. And if we throw out experience and evidence and data, then there's not going to be a transformation. And I think we've seen that globally, of course, with many issues of discarding scientific evidence or expert input. And so I really believe that for whatever we're going to call our more sustainable, transformational systems, we really need to support the scientific research and of course, a compassionate approach and humanitarian approach to the farmers that have many challenges right now. And as Nassib said, many are not, don't have access to food security. So we really need both those things. And so for me, talking about ideology and tribes and people choosing tribes when it comes to agriculture, I don't think it's helpful. I really, of course, I'm a scientist myself, but I do feel very strongly that we have to base our policies and helping farmers based on scientific evidence. So I don't work in agroecology myself, but I really support the kind of work that Fred and others are doing, and I do think that we need funds to support the scientific research and not simply just promoting ideologies that's untethered from the needs of farmers in the field.
So that leads back to the money point that Nassib made, and funding often does come into these things. When I did some recent interviews with scientists about conservation agriculture, they were mentioning that it seems that often funding, donor organizations or whatever, funding rather than science tends to drive agricultural policies. So is this a good or a bad thing, and does it apply to agroecology? Fred, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, as Pam said, I think we've seen that political lobbyists are getting power in many agendas, and often like the science is not really, it's not the best science that is informing policies. I mean, we can see that for the climate crisis, we can see that also in a way for the biodiversity crisis, even for, I mean, the COVID-19 crisis, I would say. So science is not always informing policy, and probably, unfortunately, less and less, and lobbyists are becoming more and more powerful. So I don't know how funding would influence policymakers. Probably also we can think about how also funding is different, is influencing the science itself. I think there's definitely also perhaps we need to recognize a funding gap also in what we would put in agroecology. I think we need also to recognize that there is much less funding going to actually proper agroecological science, and I'm not talking of lobbying, to document, as Pam said, to be able to really document and document trade-off and what is positive and negative in all this approach. I think there's a funding gap definitely in agroecology that needs to be recognized, beside the issue of science informing policies.
Mm-hmm. Nassib, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I'll not differ from Fred and Pam, and I would say credible scientific evidence should inform agriculture policies. And to me, I would be fair that, every donor who funds have their interests, and whether the funding is going into agroecology or the funding is going into non-agroecology, to me, as someone who has been trained as an agriculture extension workers, I'd love to see that funding ultimately seeks to care for the needs of the farmer, and not to care for the needs of the donor, like, their ideologies and whatever they are romanticizing about. So I would say agriculture policies should be based on evidence, and we know that the best way we can formulate policies is looking at the data and what's it's telling us about the state of agriculture as it is today. And everyone can agree that the status of agriculture in Africa right now needs a transformation. And we should have that honest conversation of how best can we transform the sector without thinking so much of, who is funding this or that, but rather broadly looking at all those, human and environmental outcomes each one of us would love to see.
So we have quite a few comments on our Facebook live stream here. Unfortunately, I cannot see a lot of them, but every now and then I can pop one up. It seems like they're only showing about 4 at a time, and I can't retrieve the rest. But it seems like more than questions, there's sort of this debate going on amongst people who are watching this, which leads me to, why does agroecology provoke such strong reactions? We've got people who think it really is, sort of the savior, the way to go for agriculture. And then others, like a recent riskmonger blog that called it a dreamer's disease that will starve millions. So, why does it provoke these reactions? And I think a big question a lot of people have is, can it feed the billions? So who wants to go first on that one? I'd like to hear all of your responses to that one, please. Pam, why don't you jump in?
Well, I would actually prefer to hear from Fred and Nassib. I'm not an expert in this. I was actually quite astonished a number of years ago now when I noticed how polarized this very benign and beautiful term had become. And so I think of myself as an agricultural scientist that was pretty surprised about this emotional polarization. And so I'd like to hear from Fred and Nassib about their thoughts on this.
I'll go. So I would say one of those folks that were like, you know, sort of tempted to have a reaction to agroecology was me. And I wrote this piece, which was sort of like a modest critique of the dominant version of agroecology. And I was arguing that the way I see the dominant version, it seems to deviate from the original version, which is the science version of agroecology that doesn't say anywhere that you can exclude technology if you were to implement agroecology. So to answer your question, some of these strong feelings come from like those who are concerned that there is a science to this term, but again, the way the various iterations around it get to confuse many people, and those with the louder voices who are like the ideologues or the movement side tend to push a version which is very conservative. So on the anti side of agroecology are those voices that are concerned that the version is being hijacked by a movement for their own reasons. And then for those who are pro agroecology, the emotions come from that deep-seated anger with industrial forms of ag, and agroecology to me seems like a proxy word for fighting industrial farming practices.
Good point. What are your thoughts, Fred?
Yeah, no, I hear what both Pam and Nassib are saying. I think people are paying more attention about the way food is produced globally, and I think that's a good thing. I think we also, people are more informed, reading more. I mean, there's access to media, etc. So I think there's also growing public awareness that, you know, the global food system, and Nassib, I'm talking of the global food system, of course, perhaps like agriculture in the South is not contributing so much, but is a major root cause in a number of crises. We cannot deny that. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, etc., and even perhaps in the emergence of diseases, and we are right in the middle of a pandemic. So I think there's growing awareness that, you know, there's a problem in the way food is produced, and perhaps people can equate that to agroecology. Agroecology might be a solution. There's also a growing mistrust in a way, and Nassib, you refer that to industrial farming. I see that a lot in France with my peers about the quality of the food that we are producing, not the quantity, but like really the quality of the food, and, you know, the sort of also animal welfare, and how is the food produced. And there's also even about like farmers themselves. I mean, there's also all these issues about like conventional system. I don't know if we can still use this term of conventional systems, but like leading also to a lot of indebtedness in Europe, for instance. This is well documented. Even suicide, etc. So I mean, there's also all these ideas that perhaps a better food system would be like with a more local food system, more smaller scale systems, and agroecology is perhaps seen as an answer to that. There's also a growing feeling of inequity globally, and the fact that small scale farmers are, you know, excluded more and more from the current food system. So I think people are paying more attention to the way food is produced. People are paying more attention to all these issues, and I think they find agroecology could be a solution. And well, we are talking of feeding the billion, but I think also we need to remember that our current food systems is failing to feed almost 1 billion people in the South, and producing more in the North doesn't seem to equate to feeding these people, to reaching these people. So we need also to produce food where it's needed, and feeding this 1 billion. I mean, if we are talking of feeding the billions, let's not forget about this 1 billion who is going hungry. And I think that's what really feeds this movement of agroecology. I mean, then after, of course, like for the against, perhaps a strict application of agroecology, as Nassib mentioned it, you know, would not lead to the sort of transformation needed, in particular to feed this 1 billion. But I think a lot of the principle of agroecology can really help. One more time, I think there's no silver bullets in all the technologies that we are promoting or talking about, agroecology or biotechnology or etc. I think we need a combination also of technology to be able to bring about the sort of transformation, real transformation that we all seek.
Mm. Pam, I just want to check in with you because I believe you have to get off here at the top of the hour. Is that correct? Okay, so I just asked Fred to stay on a little bit, but I just want to thank you for joining us. Now, are there any last parting words you'd like to add?
No, just thank you very much. I really appreciate the discussion, and I've learned a lot, and enjoy the rest of your discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Pam.
Thank you.
Okay, so we won't go on too much longer than this because I just checked on Facebook and I haven't gotten any specific questions there. It seems more like their discussion, but we do have one question in chat, which is, knowledge-intensive farming is viable only if the farmer is rewarded by a higher price for its produce. This restricts agroecology to the same niche as organic farming. In addition, inputs for agroecology farming are only available in the developed world. Considering these and the fact that you need more land to produce the same amount of food, isn't it irresponsible to promote agroecology for Africa? Would either of you like to respond to that?
I mean, yeah, on the fact that you need organic resources that are only available in the north. I mean, it's true that it's far easier to recycle organic resources in the north where there is like a surplus of waste and nitrogen, etc., than in the south where actually there's a huge deficit. I mean, this is a Goldilocks situation: too much in the north and too little in the south. So I mean, this is what I tried to mention earlier about like recycling. I mean, you need also nutrients to be able to recycle those nutrients. So I think that's why perhaps we need a bit of pragmatism there. We need to actually at least prompt the system with nutrients in order to have some nutrients to recycle. That's for sure. I agree with this comment. We have surpluses in the north and we can recycle. We have a lot of options to use this organic material in the north and far less in the south. Yeah, just on this specific point.
Yeah, and going off what you just said and what the person who asked sort of aired is that, sometimes the very principles of agroecology and what they seek to achieve sort of get contradictory in some contexts. Like if you're seeking to have, a fairer food system and, that doesn't create any sort of burden for whoever is in that system, then you would be careful to not want to just run away with it as sort of the only approach, because we know in places like Africa, already farmers comprise more than, women farmers comprise more than 70% of those who farm. And we know that the nature of practices that agroecology call for sometimes will make it for women farmers to spend more time in the gardens, which would result into additional labor burden on top of other, burdens that already women have in Africa. So I would say sometimes, the agroecology version, which is sort of radical, tends to not have these nuances and contextual complexities of how much can it really achieve in this context without creating additional burdens to people who are already burdened, like women farmers.
Mm-hmm. And Fred, I think you sort of addressed this, but I'll just bring it up again since it is here as a question, and that is, how do you explain the fact that an organization such as FAO takes in consideration the scientific and movement aspect of agroecology in their 10 elements of agroecology? And the fact that this framework has been approved by FAO member countries. So maybe you could both address that if you'd like.
But I'm not part of FAO, so it's hard for me to talk in the name of FAO, but I don't think this is a bad thing that FAO also like put in place some of those principles that are linked more to the movement. I think I think, as I said, like with the definition of, for example, sustainable intensification, I think we all aim at increasing food quantity and quality with minimum negative consequences for the environment and also minimum social consequences. I mean, we know this can lead to inequity, etc., growing inequity, displacement of farmers. So I think like to put that in place as one of the components, and some of those components in the definition of agroecology is not really a bad thing. I mean, to talk about co-construction, I think we would all agree with that. I mean, to talk about like fair systems, etc., sovereignty, etc., I think this is fair, and this is just recognizing that. One more time, talking about the trade-off. I mentioned trade-off earlier on, like to not push productivity at all costs. So I'm not sure I've got a problem with that. I'm not sure I understood the comment very well, but a problem with that. I mean, it's just stating that we don't want to increase productivity at all costs and recognizing other trade-offs and making sure that we mitigate against those.
Okay, good. I think that was the question. So, Nassib?
Yeah, my major concern with big intergovernmental organizations like FAO is the power they have in terms of shaping the agricultural agenda globally and on the continent. And I'm afraid if they choose to fund the radical version of agroecology, which sort of restricts modern ag innovations, it would be very detrimental for farming in Africa. So I'm 100% for funding agroecology, but we should be careful which version of agroecology here is being promoted. Is it the version that seeks to be inclusive of all options that farmers can have within their farming context, or we are pushing a version that restricts options farmers can adopt on their farm? So that should be our worry. FAO is a powerful organization, and we should be concerned which version of agroecology are they trying to promote, and that should worry us if the version they are promoting is the one which seeks to restrict options for farmers.
Again, it goes back into these questions of definitions of terms. I mean, I'm a writer, so I'm very interested in language, but we oftentimes all seem to have our own ideas on what words and concepts and things mean, which makes it so difficult to communicate and move forward. We have another question here, which they're thanking you for participating, and they'd like to know what you think the role played by big agrochemical industrial companies and supermarket distributions are. I guess sort of your thoughts on the whole production distribution system and how that might work in with an agricultural system. So we've got the role that's currently played by agro-industrial companies and supermarket distributions, and how could that fit into an is that dominating, and could an agroecological system fit into that, I guess is sort of what they're asking.
I think supermarket distribution definitely in the north is a problem. I mean, I've got a lot of my friends are farmers. I mean, I come also from a farming background in Europe, and definitely I think the supermarkets are taking the lion's share actually of the value produced by farmers, and they are becoming very powerful, and it's a bit of an oligarchy. So, and I think it echoes the previous comments about how farmers can be rewarded for their knowledge. If it's a knowledge-intensive system, you know, more labor, more care being placed on this product, and actually a product of higher quality. Indeed, I do believe that farmers should be rewarded, and often this value is not transferred back to the farmer with these large supermarket distribution systems, which are becoming very, very dominant and very powerful, with prices that are really broken down, and often the farmer is suffering there. So I think, like, yes, there is this whole idea of local food system, which is already part of this agroecology definition. And well, it's not always easy for actually, this is not something that applies to everyone, of course, having the luxury of, you know, going to your neighbor who's a farmer and to pick your own strawberries, etc. So that's a bit of a luxury, and I think it echoes very much what Nassib was saying about, like, the sort of divide we have. We cannot apply, you know, the thinking that we have in agriculture in the north to the, you know, the same thinking we have in agriculture in the south. But in the north, definitely, like the power that those supermarket distribution systems exert is definitely worrying to me.
Mm.
Yeah, and going off that, I would say, you know, the context is a little different for places like, you know, Africa and most places in sub-Saharan Africa, that the distribution networks or food supply chains are relatively short. And I would say that farmers or whoever is involved in a given food supply chain should get an equal share of what they deserve. And when you look at agroecology and all, you know, the practices they call for, some of these might require additional time for farmers. And I would really want farmers to be rewarded for any extra burden a new agriculture approach puts on them. So, and you know, those things had to think about how best can we reward farmers. And I think that's where we need better policies, you know, issues that are economic, political, social, require good policies in place to see that everyone involved in that sort of system gets a fair share of their contribution.
I think that's a good point about funding transitions, because I have a friend who's trying to transition family land in Illinois from, you know, sort of chemical soy and bean production to organic. And then in talking with some of the conservation agriculture scientists, they were saying one constraint for farmers is, you know, what do you do when you're trying to transition this land, but you really need all of it for your production? So I think that that whole process of supporting farmers through a transition to another system is really something we need to look at. So in regard to this idea of sort of the agrochemical companies, I mean, do you think that they are trying to quash agroecology, or what are your thoughts on their role in this movement?
To me, it's not a question of, you know, squashing or sort of war between those different disciplines, but I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the funding gap. I mean, those companies are very well funded research programs. I think Bayer right now is over $1 billion a year going into research, so that's huge. And this is actually more than what any government would, I think, in the world are investing in agroecology right now, if I'm not mistaken. So this is huge. So I think it's not really perhaps like a physically squashing, you know, the other discipline, but in terms of a funding gap, and it has an impact then, of course, on what gets promoted or not. I think it plays a role, yes.
Mm-hmm. Your thoughts, Nassib?
Well, I don't know. I'll be fair to say that, you know, all these food fights and politics, you can't underestimate who are the players that we don't get to see at the forefront of these fights. And you realize that at the end, you know, the ultimate end users like farmers end up being the victims of, like, you know, whether it's, you know, big ag companies, you know, fighting agroecology, or those, you know, purist environmentalists who feel a certain way about farming, funding agroecology. To me, I would say that I wish we sort of thought about the farmer first and ask all these basic questions of, like, what would a farmer in Africa right now who is growing cassava, which is having cassava mosaic disease, need? And then we see all the players who can contribute to solving this problem. Whether that means that player comes from industry, whether that player comes from an agroecological movement, I would love to see that happening, rather than fronting the interest first of, you know, the donors or companies. We should, like, be putting interests of farmers and consumers and ask the best questions of what do they want and who can best contribute to whatever their needs are.
I think I agree also with that. I think we, as researchers, and the three of us on this panel, where our researchers, I think our role is really to increase the range of possibilities for farmers. It's just to increase the size of the basket of options. And I think that's fundamentally what researchers should do. It's really being demand-driven and being able to propose solutions and increase the range of these solutions for farmers. I think that's really our mandate, yeah, or what it should be.
Yeah, that is. So in that regard, is there a place for biotechnology and agroecology, or can those principles be compatible or synergistic in any way?
Is it for Nassib?
Their view.
Of course, as I said before, that there's a great opportunity for some of the newer advances in biotechnology. We are seeing how much CRISPR is changing how we are thinking about genetic engineering. And all those who are opposed to like genetically modified crops for reasons like, you know, foreign DNA, we've seen that newer biotech tools like CRISPR are able to sort of engineer a crop without bringing in external DNA. And when you largely look at what the agroecological movement seeks to achieve, which is, you know, minimizing the damage agriculture can have on the environment, how about if we looked at which biotech crops can fit within this model? Pamela Ronald just told us about BT crops where you don't need pesticides. How about if we looked at ways in which we can incorporate such biotech innovations that almost fit within the principles that agroecology seeks to advance? And also, if agroecology is concerned about big ag and corporations, how about if I told you about biotech, which is led by public sector scientists like in Uganda, where it's not a corporation or big company trying to profiteer off farmers? So I think these are the sort of conversations we need to have on a case-by-case basis when it comes to which biotech and how can it be best applied within the agroecological thinking.
Okay, so this will be our last question here, and that is, you know, I think whether you're a scientist or a farmer or an advocacy group or whatever, people tend to get into their own little system and want to stay there. So is there a one-size-fits-all approach to agriculture, one method that should be adopted around the world? What are your thoughts on that, or how should we approach that issue of which one is used?
There cannot be a one-size-fits-all for farming. Farming is so diverse. I mean, even in a single country in Eastern or Southern Africa, for instance, in Uganda, you have a massive diversity. You come to Zimbabwe, you have a massive diversity. So of course, we need local adaptation. That's for sure. And I think that's why it's well recognized in one of the 10 components of agroecology, this sort of bottom-up territorial approach. And I think this is important. And I think that's what also seduces a lot of people in terms of agroecology as a movement. It's really this sort of bottom-up and territorial approach. I think, one more time, we are researchers here. So I think from an R&D perspective, I think it brings an interesting tension there. I refer to the example of, for example, this landscape in Ethiopia, which is like a very nice landscape, but it's very difficult to scale out actually the learning from this particular landscape elsewhere. It's a bit the same, like we cannot actually, R&D doesn't have the funding to actually adapt to each and every landscape and each and every community. So there's an interesting tension there between developing innovations, developing technologies that have a sufficiently large recommendation domain, or where it can really fit a sufficiently large population, and this need for local adaptation. So I think that's an art in a way in terms of targeting and in terms of scaling, which is part of R&D in agriculture. So I think it's an interesting tension. So yes, we need adaptation, we need local adaptation, but also, I mean, to interest public investment, private investment, and even to be able to use efficiently R&D funding. I mean, we need also to recognize these recommendation domains and develop innovations that work for more than a small community, but still be able to adapt it. I don't know if I make sense.
Yes, that did make perfect sense. Nassib?
Yeah, absolutely not. We know that the complexities surrounding farming are so like the same principle that agroecology seeks to advance, which is, thinking about farming and food systems in a complex way, is the same approach we should have in terms of solutions. We need to be a little more humble and complex in how we think of solutions and whether they are adapted to the context in which we are trying to apply them. And I'm going to sound cliche here, but we cannot address agricultural problems of the 21st century with the 19th century solutions. We know that the world we are in, even right now, is totally different from the world that was last year. And we don't even know the dire impacts of what COVID is going to have on the food system. So I would say let's be more open to whatever options we can have to address the multiplicity of challenges that keep changing, that keep being unpredictable. As we are speaking now, just in around the start of this year, there were desert locusts that ravaged most parts of Kenya and Uganda, and we are yet to see what sort of damage that is going to have. And so we need to have that humility and complexity in terms of embracing all options that can help to address these problems.
I think it's quite true that we're going to be seeing more and more challenges for agriculture with climate change and other social issues too. So hopefully this is a discussion we can continue to have, and I'm disappointed that our other two panelists weren't able to join or decided not to join, because I think it would have added to the discussion. But I really appreciate what the two of you added to this, and that your willingness to sit down and talk about this today. And I think maybe the next step would be to try to get together a group of farmers who are using different systems and see how they're all faring in that. So are there any parting words that either of you would like to share? Okay, great. Well, thank you.
I do have one. We need we need a version of agroecology. Maybe we call it agroecology 3.0, which is embracing of all options for farmers rather than being exclusive of options.
Inclusive rather than exclusive. Yeah, that seems to be one of the trends in society. So, all right. Well, thank you both very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I thank those who listened in on Facebook and on Zoom here. So until the next time, thanks very much.